For centuries, the Galactic Council had ruled over the stars with a sense of absolute authority. They were proud, confident, and many would say arrogant. Every species under their rule respected or feared their decisions. The Council believed it was their responsibility to maintain order across thousands of worlds, to ensure that peace reigned in a universe that could easily descend into chaos. They saw themselves as guardians, judges, and the ultimate arbiters of civilization. No other race could match their wisdom, or so they thought. Humans were one of the youngest members of this vast galactic community. Compared to the ancient races, humanity was still raw, unpredictable, and sometimes reckless. The Council had watched them for centuries, analyzing their ways, measuring their strengths, and quietly deciding whether they should be kept close or controlled. Humans were talented, no doubt. They had an instinct for invention, a skill for problem-solving, and a curiosity that often led them to explore the farthest reaches of space. Yet the Council always treated them as a sort of wild card, something to be handled carefully, like a volatile chemical in a delicate experiment. The humans themselves didn't care much about the Council's opinions. They had their own ways of doing things, their own rules, and their own sense of morality. They didn't bow to traditions they found pointless, nor did they respect rules simply because someone older or taller enforced them. This independence both intrigued and frustrated the Council. In many ways, humans were the perfect combination of genius and chaos. They could build wonders, explore new worlds, and solve problems that had baffled the greatest minds in the galaxy. But their unpredictability made the Council uneasy. Over time, the Council's meetings often included discussions about humanity. Some members admired them secretly, impressed by their resourcefulness and courage. Others despised them, considering humans reckless troublemakers who might one day destabilize the fragile balance of power. The debates could last for days, but the conclusion was always the same. Humans were dangerous if left unchecked, yet too small and disorganized to pose a real threat. And so the Council decided that humanity needed guidance, or rather control. But the humans were never the type to follow orders blindly. Whenever the Council tried to impose regulations to restrict trade routes or control technological advancement, humanity found ways around it. They adapted, innovated, and sometimes openly defied the Council's directives. It wasn't maliciousness, it was their nature. They didn't see rules as something to fear. They saw rules as challenges to overcome. Where others would follow instructions, humans would ask why. Where others would surrender, they would fight. And when confronted with obstacles, they would find ways to turn them into advantages. This constant defiance irritated the Council. Many members began to believe that humanity needed to be reminded of its place. There were whispers in the grand chambers of the Council about sanctions, about restricting human colonies, even about isolating Earth itself. They spoke of it with the cold certainty of those who believed themselves untouchable. After all, humans had always been contained by their own limits, or so the Council thought. Meanwhile, humans continued their lives almost oblivious to the growing tension. On Earth and in the colonies scattered across the galaxy, they built their cities, designed new starships, explored planets, and experimented with science that even the Council didn't fully understand. They learned from every mistake, using failure not as a punishment but as a teacher. Children studied the stars not out of fear, but out of curiosity. Communities worked together not because they were forced, but because they believed in creating something better for everyone. Humanity was building, growing, and thriving in ways the Council could not control. There were moments, though, when humans sensed the Council's watchful eyes. They noticed the subtle restrictions placed on their ships at checkpoints, the veiled criticisms during interstellar conferences, and the endless scrutiny of their technology. Humans laughed at it quietly, but they never panicked. They knew that power alone didn't define superiority. Intelligence, creativity, and the ability to adapt were just as important, and humans had all three in abundance. The Council's arrogance, however, blinded them to this reality. They assumed that because they were older and more experienced, they could dictate the course of humanity's future. They assumed that fear and punishment were enough to keep humans in line. They assumed that humans would eventually bend to their will, like so many other species had done. This assumption would prove to be their first and perhaps greatest mistake. Within the Council's chambers, decisions were made with grand speeches, elaborate procedures, and an air of invincibility. Members argued over trade routes, the control of mineral-rich planets, and the enforcement of galactic law. Humanity was often the subject of these discussions, their actions dissected as if they were simple experiments. Some council members even joked about how easy it would be to manipulate humans if only they applied the right pressure. They did not realize, or perhaps refused to see, that humans were not like other races. Pressure could break some, but it only strengthened humanity. Limitations could confine some, but humans always found a way beyond. On Earth, humans were unaware of the Council's plotting. They had their own concerns, harsh planets to terraform, dangerous creatures to study, and scientific mysteries that defied explanation. They were too busy creating their future to worry about the judgments of an ancient assembly in a distant hall of stars. Every innovation they made, every challenge they overcame, strengthened them quietly and steadily. The Council did not notice because it assumed that humans could only operate within the boundaries set for them. It never occurred to them that humans were already thinking far beyond those boundaries. Over time, resentment began to grow among Council members who believed that humans needed to be taught a lesson. They debated what form that lesson should take, warnings, sanctions, even interventions. But none dared act openly, for they knew that humans, though small in number compared to other races, were unpredictable and intelligent. They feared provoking humanity, yet their arrogance convinced them they could control it. The irony was invisible to them. The very traits they underestimated in humans, their adaptability, their patience, their ability to learn, were the traits that would one day overturn the Council's authority. Humans, meanwhile, continued their work. They explored new star systems, established peaceful colonies, and refined their technologies in ways the Council could not even imagine. Yet they did so quietly, subtly, without announcing their advancements to anyone. Not because they were secretive, but because they understood the value of self-reliance. They had learned, through centuries of observation, that those who shout the loudest often attract the wrong attention. Humans preferred to grow in silence, to prepare for the challenges they knew would inevitably come. The stage was set for a quiet tension that no one in the Council fully comprehended. Humans appeared small, their influence limited, their numbers modest. Yet behind the scenes, they were building strength, wisdom, and resilience. They were learning not only to survive in a galaxy ruled by the arrogant and the powerful, but also to thrive without the approval or oversight of those who deemed themselves superior. In the grand halls of the Council, debates continued, speeches were made, and decisions passed with a sense of certainty that bordered on hubris. The Council believed that humanity was still a minor player in the vast theater of the stars, a curiosity to be monitored, but not feared. They did not notice that humans were already observing them, understanding them, and preparing for a future in which the Council's arrogance would meet consequences they could not imagine. Humans had never sought power for the sake of power. They had never desired to dominate, control, or impose. They wanted knowledge, growth, and freedom, the freedom to explore, to learn, and to create without interference. And yet, in that simple pursuit, they became something the Council could not predict. A force that was patient, clever, and ultimately unstoppable. It was a quiet tension, almost invisible, like a shadow stretching across a room without anyone noticing. The Council laughed at the thought that humans could ever rise above their expectations. But humans were already rising, not through force, not through rebellion, but through the steady, quiet accumulation of understanding, skills, and unity. Every invention, every discovery, every act of cooperation brought them closer to a point that the Council would never see coming. And so, as the Council debated, as it planned, as it prided itself on its wisdom and authority, humanity continued to grow in silence. They had no desire for confrontation, no need for recognition, and no intention of proving themselves prematurely. They were preparing for a day when their ingenuity and patience would speak louder than any decree, louder than any law, louder than the arrogance of those who believed themselves untouchable. The Council had no idea that the real lesson was already in motion. Humanity, quiet and unassuming, was learning the greatest skill of all, how to survive, thrive, and prepare for the future without the need for approval, without the need for interference, and without the need to fight. And in their silence, they were already unstoppable. When the first signs appeared, the Council barely noticed. A few human ships failed to check in at scheduled intervals. A few colonies reported no messages from Earth in weeks, even months. The Council assumed it was a technical glitch, a minor problem that would resolve itself. After all, humans had always been unpredictable. They were prone to delays, strange decisions, and sometimes unexplained actions. The idea that something significant was happening did not cross their minds. But as time passed, the evidence became impossible to ignore. More and more human colonies went silent. Trade shipments stopped arriving. Scientific expeditions vanished mid-mission. Communications, once constant and reliable, fell into eerie quiet. The council began to worry, but still their concern was framed through arrogance. They assumed that humans had encountered some obstacle, perhaps a natural disaster, or that their recklessness had finally caught up with them. They did not consider the possibility that humans had deliberately withdrawn. Humans had withdrawn, but not out of fear, not because of some catastrophe and not because of weakness. They left quietly, methodically, without announcing their departure. Entire star systems that had once been vibrant with human life were now silent. Cities, laboratories, and research facilities emptied almost overnight. It was not chaos that marked their leaving. It was order, precision, and calm. No alarms sounded. No warnings were sent. It was as if humanity had simply stepped out of existence, leaving the council to assume they were still in control. The departure was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Humans had been part of the council for decades. They had contributed to scientific research, exploration missions, trade negotiations, and diplomatic efforts. Their voices, often underestimated, had influenced key decisions. Their absence should have caused alarm immediately, yet the council's pride blinded them. They believed humans would never leave. To them, the idea was inconceivable. Humans had been a part of the system for so long that their withdrawal seemed impossible. The first council scout sent to investigate returned with strange reports. Human colonies were intact, not destroyed. Starships were missing, but docks and stations were abandoned in perfect order. Laboratories, research centers, and even homes had been evacuated systematically. Nothing was broken. Nothing was stolen. The humans had left everything as it was, but they had vanished. The scouts could not explain it. They found no sign of struggle, no evidence of a natural disaster, and no trace of mass exodus by other species. It was as if the humans had learned to step silently through the galaxy and simply disappear. Panic began to creep into the council chambers, though none of the members would admit it openly. Whispers grew louder, debates grew heated, and accusations started to fly. They cannot have left voluntarily, one member argued. They are too small, too young, too insignificant to make a choice this bold. Another member countered, perhaps something happened we do not understand. Perhaps they were wiped out by forces beyond our knowledge. Even the council's oldest and wisest members were at a loss. They could not explain humanity's disappearance, and the uncertainty unsettled them. Meanwhile, humanity was not hiding. They were active, moving, exploring, and preparing, but they did so far from the eyes of the council. Planets in uncharted regions became new laboratories. Space stations in remote systems became hubs for learning and innovation. Entire fleets that had once participated in council missions were now deployed for exploration, defense, and the careful observation of the galaxy. Humans had taken nothing by force, destroyed nothing in anger. They simply chose to live beyond the reach of those who sought to control them. The silence had a strange effect on the council. At first, they assumed that humans were trapped somewhere, lost or defeated. Months passed, then years, and still there was no sign of human activity in the areas they had once controlled. The council sent larger fleets, more advanced probes, and even secret operatives to investigate, but each mission returned with the same result. Nothing. The humans had left, and the council had no idea where they had gone or why. Speculation ran rampant among the council. Some members feared an alien attack had destroyed humanity. Others worried that the humans had discovered a weapon too powerful to be allowed in the galaxy. Few, very few, even considered the possibility that humanity had chosen to leave of its own accord. To imagine that a species could simply vanish, leaving all the power, resources, and influence behind, was beyond their comprehension. In the meantime, humanity continued quietly. They moved with purpose and foresight, carefully avoiding detection when necessary. Their departure was not an act of defiance. It was an act of prudence. They understood the council's arrogance, its tendency to underestimate, and its inability to perceive the long game. By withdrawing silently, they avoided confrontation while simultaneously creating a space to grow stronger. wiser, and more capable. Human colonies that had been abandoned were left perfectly intact. Machines continued to function. Research data was carefully archived. Even food supplies were stored properly. It was as if the humans had simply paused their presence, leaving the galaxy to assume they were gone without understanding the depth of what had actually occurred. The precision and care of their departure revealed a level of planning that far exceeded anything the Council had ever expected from them. The Council, of course, noticed the emptiness eventually, but it was too late to reverse their assumptions. They assumed that if humans were gone, the galaxy itself would be easier to manage. They believed that without human ingenuity complicating matters, trade routes would stabilize, rebellions could be controlled more easily, and the balance of power would tip in their favor. What they did not realize was that the very systems humans had touched, the technology, the infrastructure, and even the politics of certain colonies, had been subtly altered. Humans had left behind more than empty cities. They had left behind the seeds of change, mechanisms that would activate when the Council least expected it. For decades, the galaxy lived with the illusion of human absence. Council members congratulated themselves on the simplicity of the universe now that humans were gone. Trade seemed to flow smoothly. Minor rebellions were quelled. Diplomacy proceeded without the interruptions humans had once caused. Yet beneath this surface, small but undeniable shifts were occurring. Trade networks began to falter. Ships miscommunicated with command centers. Artificial intelligence systems, once maintained with human ingenuity, began to fail in ways no one could predict. Every system humans had influenced was slowly adapting to function without them, but it was doing so according to rules the Council did not understand. The first hint of the consequences appeared almost imperceptibly. A fleet that had departed for routine patrol never arrived at its destination. A planet that was supposed to receive supplies went without for months. Minor incidents began to snowball. The Council scrambled to respond, but every action they took seemed to trigger more problems rather than solve them. The absence of humans was not merely a missing presence. It was a gap, a void where foresight, creativity, and careful planning had once existed. Within human-controlled regions, life continued calmly, even joyfully. Humans had learned that power was not about domination or fear, but about preparation and patience. They had withdrawn not to punish but to live freely, to grow quietly, and to ensure that their own survival and progress would never again be threatened by those who underestimated them. Far from the Council's view, they explored new technologies, built new communities, and shared knowledge in ways that strengthened their species without causing alarm. The Council, meanwhile, began to feel the tension building. Their confidence was shaken. No longer could they assume control. Every attempt to intervene or investigate was met with frustration and failure. Even their oldest, most trusted advisors could not predict what the humans had done or where they had gone. Rumors began to circulate within the Council chambers. Some members whispered of unknown human capabilities. Others feared that humans had discovered secrets of the universe too dangerous to comprehend. A growing unease settled over the Council, a creeping anxiety that no amount of pride or authority could dispel. By now, decades had passed since the first signs of human withdrawal. The galaxy itself had adapted to their absence, but not without consequence. Systems once maintained by humans were now malfunctioning in subtle ways. Trade was slower, conflicts more frequent, and the balance of power more precarious. Every Council member could sense it, though none dared say it aloud. Humanity's departure had changed everything. Yet they could not see the full picture. They could not see that humanity had not left because of fear, weakness, or defeat. Humanity had left to prepare, to grow, and to watch. And so the silence of humans became the loudest statement of all. The Council had underestimated them for centuries, dismissed their abilities, and assumed their loyalty and compliance. But humanity had chosen a different path. They did not seek to destroy the Council. They did not seek revenge. They simply withdrew, creating space for themselves to evolve beyond the understanding of any other species. It was a quiet revolution, one that would eventually shake the foundations of the galaxy. The Council believed they had removed a complication, but in reality, years had passed since humans quietly withdrew from the galaxy, and what had once seemed like an ordinary absence now began to reveal itself as a profound problem. The Council had grown restless, their confidence slowly eroding with each passing month. Systems that had been reliable for centuries were faltering, trade routes were disrupted, and even minor colonies began to rebel. The arrogance that had once defined the Council now teetered on the edge of panic. At first, the Council blamed the disruptions on minor issues, mechanical failures, natural disasters, or the incompetence of local administrators. But as time went on, it became clear that these problems were not isolated or random. They were connected, subtle threads of chaos that wove through the galaxy like an invisible storm. Ships miscommunicated with command centers. Fleets arrived at wrong destinations, and supply lines meant to sustain thousands of worlds began to collapse. Every system humans had influenced seemed to resist control, almost as if it had learned to function without the Council. Internal tensions within the Council intensified. Members who had once been allies now turned against one another. Arguments erupted over responsibility, with each faction blaming others for the growing failures. Some suggested more aggressive intervention, sending fleets to forcibly re-establish order, reclaim abandoned human colonies, or seize technology left behind. Others argued that such actions would only worsen the problem, but no consensus could be reached. Decision after decision was delayed, debated, and vetoed. In the absence of humans, the Council's unity began to crumble. Meanwhile, smaller species that had long been under the Council's strict control began to see opportunities. Without human influence stabilizing trade and security, these civilizations started to assert themselves. Borders that had once been firmly enforced were now crossed without consequence. Local governments grew bolder, refusing to follow Council mandates. Some even formed alliances, challenging the authority of the Council directly. The galaxy that the Council had believed secure and manageable now showed signs of instability, and they were powerless to stop it. The first signs of human strategy became apparent to some Council members, though few understood their significance. Systems humans had maintained were not merely failing, they were evolving in unexpected ways. AI networks once designed to serve the Council now operated autonomously, redistributing resources, managing energy systems, and adjusting defenses without orders. These changes were subtle, nearly invisible to those who lacked human foresight, but they were deliberate. Humans had not abandoned the galaxy recklessly. They had engineered it to function according to their design, even in their absence. Council members who began to notice these changes felt a mixture of fear and disbelief. How could a species they had considered immature and limited leave such a lasting mark? Humans, they realized, had been quietly preparing for a future the Council could not predict. Every act of departure, every abandoned colony, and every silent starship was part of a plan that slowly unfolded over time. The very systems that the Council had relied upon were now controlled by unseen forces, forces designed by humans themselves. As the years continued, the Council's confidence deteriorated further. Meetings that once showcased their authority now became arenas of conflict and frustration. Members accused one another of negligence, incompetence, and betrayal. Suggestions of purging certain sectors of the galaxy or forcing a return of human colonies were debated, but each proposal seemed more desperate than the last. The Council had lost the clarity it once prided itself on. Its systems were failing, its decisions were delayed, and the absence of humans had left a void that no one else could fill. Humanity, meanwhile, remained silent observers. They did not intervene to punish or dominate the Council. They had no desire for conflict, yet they watched carefully, noting the weaknesses that had been exposed by centuries of arrogance. Their absence was not emptiness, it was a mirror, reflecting the Council's own flaws back at them. Every mismanaged fleet, every failed colony, every rebellion within the Council's sphere was a consequence of decisions the humans had quietly prepared for. Humanity had taught the galaxy a lesson without firing a single shot. Small rebellions became larger as the Council's authority weakened. Worlds that had once followed orders without question now resisted openly. Trade hubs refused to process goods for the Council, preferring local leadership. Military units stationed on distant planets ignored commands, citing outdated strategies or lack of guidance. The very systems that had allowed the Council to maintain its power were now unraveling piece by piece. Those who had once feared humanity began to realize the irony. It was not humans who were destabilizing the galaxy. It was the absence of humans, the vacuum they left behind, and the failure of the council to understand the long-term consequences of their own arrogance. A few council members attempted to take matters into their own hands. They sent fleets to abandoned human colonies, hoping to reclaim infrastructure, study technology, or reassert dominance. Yet each attempt met with strange complications. Ships malfunctioned without warning. Communication systems misrouted signals. Energy grids overloaded unexpectedly. It was as if the colonies themselves, or the systems humans had touched, were resisting interference. No one could explain the failures. The council began to fear not just human intelligence, but the invisible influence they had left behind. Some members began to suspect that humans had intentionally prepared the galaxy for this moment. They whispered about human foresight, a term that grew in both fear and awe. Could a species so young truly have anticipated the weaknesses of the council, the vulnerabilities of its systems, and the consequences of its own arrogance? Those who pondered the question realized the terrifying answer: yes. Humans had not acted recklessly. They had acted with purpose, patience, and strategy that far exceeded the understanding of any other race. The council's sense of control eroded further as systems continued to fail. Trade routes that had once connected thousands of planets became unreliable. Food and energy distribution suffered. Communications slowed. Even defensive measures meant to protect colonies became inefficient, leaving worlds vulnerable. It became clear that the council could no longer govern effectively. The absence of humans had created a chain reaction of consequences, destabilizing the galaxy at every level. Panic began to seep into the council chambers. For the first time in centuries, members questioned the foundations of their authority. They realized that the arrogance that had once defined them, believing themselves untouchable and wise beyond measure, had blinded them to the truth. The truth was that humans had always been underestimated, and now that underestimation was unraveling the entire system they had tried to control. Some counselors proposed radical solutions, desperate to regain a sense of control. They debated creating new technologies, developing artificial intelligence systems, or forging new alliances to replace human influence. But each attempt seemed doomed. The systems humans had designed, even in their absence, were beyond immediate repair. The very infrastructure of the galaxy had been subtly altered to function without the council. In trying to assert authority, the counselors realized that every action seemed to accelerate the instability, rather than fix it. Meanwhile, humans continued their work far from the council's eyes. They explored new worlds, experimented with new sciences, and developed new technologies. But they did not do so recklessly. Every step they took was measured, deliberate, and careful. They understood the power of patience, and they watched the council struggle with consequences that were entirely of its own making. Humanity's withdrawal was no longer just an absence, it was a quiet, controlled test. They observed, learned, and ensured that the galaxy would eventually understand the cost of arrogance. As instability grew, even the most confident counselors began to fear the consequences. They had underestimated humans for centuries, believing that youth, small numbers, and unpredictability were weaknesses, but they had failed to see that these very traits, combined with intelligence and patience, made humans almost unstoppable. The realization was terrifying. The Council's failures were not caused by outside enemies or natural disasters. They were caused by the absence of a species they had dismissed, a species they had underestimated, a species that had quietly withdrawn and prepared for a future the Council could not predict. In the council chambers, arguments turned into crises. Decisions that once took hours now took weeks as every action seemed to produce more problems than solutions. Alliances within the council fractured. Old rivalries resurfaced. Factions fought for dominance, blaming one another for the growing instability. The galaxy, once a tightly controlled network of power and influence, now teetered on the brink of chaos. And still, humanity remained silent. They did not intervene, did not declare war, did not enforce any rule. Their absence was the lesson, the demonstration of foresight and preparation. The systems they had touched continued to operate, subtly reshaping themselves in ways the Council could not understand. Humans had not left the galaxy powerless. They had left the Council to face the consequences of its own arrogance. The cracks in the Council's authority grew wider each day. What had once been pride and unity became fear, confusion. The first signs were subtle, almost unnoticeable. But they spread like ripples across the galaxy. The Council had grown used to managing systems with confidence, believing that their authority and technology were unshakable. Yet one by one the signs of failure appeared. Communications that had been flawless for centuries began to falter. Fleets sent on routine patrols did not arrive where they were expected. Supply lines that had sustained thousands of worlds began to crumble. At first, Council members dismissed these incidents as isolated malfunctions. They assumed minor errors, mechanical failures, or operator mistakes. But the errors continued, multiplying faster than anyone could explain. Ships misread coordinates, energy grids overloaded, and automated systems shut down at critical moments. Every attempt to repair the problems seemed to create new ones. It became clear that the issues were not random. They were connected, as if some unseen hand was guiding the galaxy's systems toward failure. Those who had been skeptical about the humans' departure began to suspect a deeper truth. Perhaps they thought humanity had planned this all along, but such an idea seemed impossible. How could a young, relatively small species engineer failures on such a massive scale? The Council had long dismissed humans as clever but limited, inventive but unpredictable. Yet now the reality of their absence was producing consequences that the Council could not control, and fear began to seep into their chambers. Meanwhile, humanity moved quietly but purposefully beyond the edge of the known galaxy. They did not intervene directly, did not attack, and did not announce their presence. Instead, they observed, monitored, and allowed their plans to unfold naturally. Every abandoned system, every silent colony had been carefully prepared. The humans had left infrastructure in place, but they had designed it so that, in the absence of their guidance, it would begin to fail. Not recklessly, not chaotically, but precisely. They understood the weaknesses of the Council and its reliance on human ingenuity, and they were now allowing the consequences to emerge. As systems began to malfunction, Council members struggled to respond. Fleets dispatched to stabilize troubled sectors often failed. Communications with colonies became garbled. Supply shipments were delayed, and defense networks malfunctioned at the most critical moments. Planets that had once been firmly under Council control found themselves isolated, vulnerable, and uncertain. Rebellion began to stir in places that had seemed loyal, and the Council could do nothing to stop it. The first wave of consequences was technical. Automated energy systems, previously maintained by human engineers, started misfiring. AI networks designed by humans to coordinate logistics began making independent decisions that defied Council directives. These systems had been designed to adapt in the absence of humans, and now they were learning, evolving, and subtly resisting interference. The Council tried to override them, but every intervention was met with failure, every command was delayed or misrouted. The galaxy was becoming a machine that no longer answered its supposed masters. Council leaders struggled to maintain order. They held emergency meetings, debated strategies, and attempted to regain control through brute force. Yet every action they took only revealed their dependence on human systems. Without humans, their fleets were less efficient, their intelligence reports less reliable, and their control over colonies weaker than they had ever imagined. The realization was both humiliating and terrifying. They had ruled with confidence for centuries, believing themselves indispensable, only to discover that their power had always depended on a species they had dismissed. Meanwhile, human observers watched quietly from the shadows of the galaxy. They had anticipated these developments long ago. Every system left behind had been designed with foresight. Each fleet, colony, and station had contingencies in place. Humans did not intervene to punish. They simply allowed the consequences to unfold, ensuring that the Council would learn the cost of arrogance in a way they could not ignore. It was a lesson in patience, planning, and observation, a demonstration of power that required no violence. Some Council members began to understand the pattern. They noticed that the failures followed a logical sequence, a chain of cause and effect that seemed almost intelligent. It was as if the systems themselves were correcting errors made over decades, removing inefficiencies and neutralizing weaknesses. The Council realized with growing dread that humans had embedded a kind of intelligence into the very fabric of the galaxy. This intelligence did not act out of anger or revenge. It acted out of calculation, foresight, and the understanding that those who relied on arrogance and control would ultimately face the consequences of their own actions. As these failures continued, the Council's authority began to unravel. Worlds once dependent on their leadership now faced crises they could not resolve. Star systems previously stable became unpredictable, with communications delayed and supply lines unreliable. Local governors, previously loyal to the council, began to make independent decisions, ignoring directives that no longer reached them in time. The structure of power the council had relied upon for centuries was dissolving before their eyes piece by piece. Rebellion was no longer isolated. It was spreading. Planets once compliant were declaring autonomy, refusing taxes and organizing defenses without council approval. Some factions even began forming alliances across borders, creating networks of cooperation that bypassed the council entirely. These movements were not chaotic. They were organized, deliberate, and strategic. Without the stabilizing influence of human oversight, the council had created a vacuum, and the galaxy was filling it on its own terms. The council's panic grew. Meetings that had once been orderly and controlled became arenas of shouting and accusations. Members blamed one another for the failures, argued over what measures to take, and grew desperate to reclaim authority. Proposals ranged from launching massive fleets to seizing human technology, to attempting to recreate human expertise artificially. Yet each plan faltered, delayed by miscommunications, technical failures, and a lack of understanding of the systems humans had left behind. Even the council's most loyal and experienced leaders began to realize that their knowledge was insufficient. Humans had not simply left, they had prepared. The infrastructure, technology, and intelligence systems humans had created were operating on principles the council could not comprehend fully. Every intervention by the council triggered new complications, demonstrating the depth of human foresight. It was not just an absence, it was a carefully orchestrated consequence, unfolding exactly as humans had intended. Humans themselves did not intervene during this time. They watched silently, allowing events to unfold while continuing their own work. New colonies were established in remote regions, research progressed without interruption, and fleets explored beyond the known galaxy. Their activities were purposeful but unobtrusive. They had no need to demonstrate force. The power of their absence and the consequences it created spoke louder than any weapon or military maneuver ever could. As the failures spread, some council members began to understand the broader lesson. It was not merely about the absence of humans, it was about the arrogance of assuming that any power could be maintained without wisdom, foresight, and care. Humans had never sought domination. They had never sought revenge. They had simply withdrawn, leaving systems, colonies, and fleets in place, but designed them to reveal the weaknesses of those who assumed control without responsibility. The council could see the truth, but it was too late to fully prevent it. Every mismanaged fleet, delayed shipment, and rebellious world was a reminder of their dependence on a species they had long dismissed. The failures were multiplying, cascading through the galaxy in ways that no single intervention could stop, and still, humanity remained silent, watching and learning. By now, even those who had doubted the intelligence of humans were forced to acknowledge their capabilities. The withdrawal had not been accidental. The consequences had not been unplanned. Every failure, every disruption, every rebellion was a carefully orchestrated outcome, designed to demonstrate that power without wisdom was fragile. The council, for all its centuries of authority, was now struggling to maintain control over systems that humans had quietly prepared to function independently, or even resist interference entirely. And so, the galaxy shifted. The council, once confident and unshakable, now faced the reality of its limitations. Humans had left, but their presence remained, embedded in the very fabric of the systems, technology, and networks they had influenced. The first wave of consequences had arrived, and it was only the beginning. The lesson was clear, though terrifying for the council. Power without foresight is fragile. Arrogance invites failure, and even the most patient, careful, and prepared species can, with silence alone, reveal the flaws of those who underestimate them. The council was beginning to see the truth, but humans, watching from the distance, knew that the real consequences were yet to unfold. They had allowed the first wave to take effect, but the galaxy had only just begun to feel the impact of their absence. Patience, observation, and preparation were humanity's greatest weapons, and the council was about to learn the full measure of their quiet, deliberate influence. The council was in chaos, yet they still did not understand the full extent of what humans had left behind. Systems were failing. Supply chains had collapsed in places that had once been the backbone of galactic stability, and fleets operated unpredictably. The council had spent decades assuming that their authority was absolute, that their decisions could control the flow of the galaxy. Now they discovered that their certainty had been an illusion, and it was unraveling faster than anyone could predict. Amid this chaos, humanity began to leave more than just empty systems behind. They left messages, hidden signals, archives, and recordings that revealed themselves only when the time was right. These were not threats or warnings in the way the council expected. They were carefully crafted lessons, designed to show the consequences of arrogance, of ignoring responsibility, and of underestimating those they claimed to guide. The first signals were subtle. A council fleet investigating a failing sector received a data transmission from an abandoned human station. The message was brief, almost polite. "We hoped you would understand sooner. Some lessons are better learned with observation." At first, the council dismissed it as a glitch or a prank, a minor technical error. But as similar messages began appearing across multiple systems, the council began to realize that humans had anticipated their movements, their failures, and even their responses. These messages were not threats. They did not contain orders or attempts at domination. Instead, they were reflections, calm, logical, and unmistakably human. They pointed out errors in planning, flaws in decision-making, and weaknesses in strategy. Every message was a mirror, showing the council how its arrogance and overconfidence had blinded it to reality. For centuries, the council had believed itself untouchable, and now humans were holding up the truth in the simplest way possible: observation and clarity. As the council read the messages, their panic deepened. It was not just that humans had left, it was that they had left in a way that forced the council to confront its own failures. Systems had been designed to fail subtly without causing outright disaster, giving the council just enough time to notice the pattern, reflect, and learn. Each failure was paired with a human note, a careful hint, or an archive detailing exactly how the council's overconfidence had led to it. Humans had orchestrated a silent lesson, and it was unfolding with precision. The council tried to respond. Fleets were redirected, engineers attempted to repair malfunctioning systems, and administrators scrambled to regain control of colonies. Yet every intervention seemed only to confirm the humans' insight. Commands that were sent too late, supplies that were misrouted, and communication systems that failed at critical moments revealed just how dependent the galaxy had been on human ingenuity. The council began to see that no brute force, no fleet, and no decree could reverse the consequences of centuries of oversight and arrogance. At the same time, humanity continued to observe. They did not reveal themselves. They did not step in to correct failures. Their message was not delivered through conflict, it was delivered through patience and subtlety. By allowing the council to face the consequences of its own mistakes, humans demonstrated a wisdom that the council could not hope to match. Every system left behind, every instruction encoded into AI networks, and every archive stored in abandoned stations was part of a carefully designed lesson that required reflection, not confrontation. The messages grew more complex and more revealing. Council members discovered archives detailing human successes, failures, and strategies. They read records of long-term planning, resource management, and coordination across systems that had once seemed chaotic to outsiders. Humans had prepared for every contingency, and in doing so had created a blueprint of foresight that was impossible for the council to ignore. The arrogance of ruling without understanding was being exposed in real time, and the council could not escape the truth. Some councilors began to experience something they had never felt before: humility. They realized that humans, the species they had long dismissed as reckless and unpredictable, had far greater vision than they had ever assumed. Humans had not acted impulsively, had not sought domination, and had not reacted with hostility. They had acted with patience, intelligence, and foresight, designing a system where consequences would teach the lessons the council had ignored for centuries. For the first time, council members felt fear, not of violence or destruction, but of knowledge and understanding. They were being confronted with the reality that their authority had depended on humans in ways they could never have predicted. The messages themselves were a form of power, subtle but absolute. They could not be ignored, they could not be destroyed, and most importantly, they could not be countered with arrogance or force. Across the galaxy, the effect was profound. Colonies that had been left intact by humans were beginning to adapt and operate independently. Local governors and administrators discovered that systems humans had prepared were capable of self-regulation. Energy grids balanced themselves, supply chains optimized themselves, and fleets coordinated with minimal oversight. The lessons encoded in the technology were slowly revealing that human foresight extended far beyond what anyone had imagined. The Council's absence from these systems was not a weakness. It was a demonstration of human intelligence and planning. Meanwhile, the Council struggled to maintain relevance. Attempts to enforce authority, issue decrees, or reclaim abandoned colonies were met with resistance, not hostility, but independence. Planets and star systems had begun functioning without the Council's guidance. Some even communicated with each other directly, forming networks of cooperation that bypassed the old power structures. It became evident that humanity's departure had not just left the Council to face technical consequences. It had left them to face the consequences of irrelevance. The messages from humans were not always technical. Some contained philosophical reflections, almost like guidance. "Power is responsibility," one message read. "Do not mistake control for wisdom. Authority without understanding is fragile." Another stated, "You took without gratitude, ruled without foresight. Now the consequences are yours to bear." These statements were calm, almost gentle in tone, but their meaning struck deeply. The Council realized that they were being judged, not by force but by insight. The lessons were inescapable. As these revelations spread, divisions within the Council intensified. Some members acknowledged the wisdom of humans, recognizing that they had misjudged the species for centuries. Others refused to believe it, insisting that humans had simply abandoned them out of weakness. The debates became heated, and factions began to form, each struggling to respond to the consequences they could no longer control. The Council's unity, once unshakable, was now a distant memory. Humanity from beyond the known regions of space continued to watch. They observed not just the failures of the Council, but the potential for growth. They understood that power could teach lessons only when paired with reflection. By leaving systems intact, encoding foresight into technology, and sending messages that encouraged contemplation, they allowed the Council a chance to learn. It was a subtle form of influence, far more profound than any fleet or weapon could have achieved. Over time, the Council began to understand that the human strategy was not about revenge. It was about responsibility. Humans had prepared a galaxy where consequences were unavoidable, and where arrogance and neglect could no longer hide behind authority. The lessons were clear. Leadership requires foresight, planning, and respect for those who contribute to your systems. Authority without understanding is temporary, fragile, and ultimately self-defeating. Yet even as these lessons became apparent, the Council was still struggling. Systems continued to fail in small cascading ways. Fleets still mismanaged themselves. Trade and communication were not fully restored. Every day brought new evidence that the absence of humans was more than a gap. It was a mirror reflecting the Council's own weaknesses back at them. The messages, archives, and guidance left by humans were reminders of what the galaxy had lost by underestimating a species that had always been underestimated. Some members began to study the human archives in detail, attempting to understand the methods, philosophies, and technologies humans had left behind. What they discovered was staggering. Humans had not only prepared systems to function without oversight, they had anticipated the very ways in which the Council would fail. Every flaw, every error, every blind spot had been considered. Humans had acted with patience and intelligence that no other species could match, demonstrating that true power lay not in domination but in preparation, foresight, and wisdom. The Council could no longer ignore the truth. Humans had not abandoned them out of fear, weakness, or impulsive rebellion. They had withdrawn deliberately, allowing the consequences of the Council's arrogance and negligence to unfold naturally. Every failure, every system malfunction, every rebellious colony was a lesson in humility, patience, and foresight. Humanity's silence had become the loudest statement of all. The galaxy was changing, and the Council had no choice but to observe. They could attempt to regain control, but they could not undo the lessons humans had embedded into the systems they once maintained. The messages, the arc. By now the council was exhausted. Years of mismanagement, cascading failures, and the silent lessons left by humans had left them fractured, desperate, and questioning everything they had believed about their power. Systems that had once been flawlessly reliable were now unpredictable. Star fleets arrived late or not at all. Supply chains collapsed repeatedly. Even the Council's communication networks, their veins of authority, misfired with alarming frequency. What had seemed like minor disruptions in the early years of humanity's absence had grown into widespread systemic collapse. Yet even in the midst of this chaos, humans remained distant, patient observers. They did not intervene to attack, nor did they step in to rescue the Council. Their withdrawal had never been an act of revenge. It was a demonstration of power, patience, and foresight. Every failing system, every misrouted fleet, every colony that had begun to act independently was a testament to the Council's overconfidence and inability to recognize the value of those they had once underestimated. Humans had left the galaxy intact, but carefully designed so that the consequences of arrogance could not be avoided. The Council now faced its most difficult reality. It was no longer in control. Their authority, once unchallenged, was a hollow shell. Colonies had become self-governing, trade networks had restructured themselves, and fleets had developed autonomous protocols that ignored delayed or conflicting commands. Even the Council's most loyal allies were beginning to question its competence. The absence of humans had revealed just how dependent the galaxy had been on their foresight, creativity, and adaptability. Authority without understanding had proven fragile, and the Council was learning this in the harshest way possible. For some Council members, this realization sparked panic. They attempted to reclaim control through force, ordering fleets to enforce compliance, demanding colonies fall in line, and issuing rapid-fire decrees in the hopes of restoring order. But every effort failed. Ships malfunctioned en route, AI systems rerouted orders, and colonies simply ignored commands that no longer made sense within the evolving network of self-regulating systems. Attempts to assert power only highlighted the Council's dependence on human ingenuity, making the absence of humans even more glaring. Meanwhile, messages left by humans began to appear across the galaxy with increasing frequency. Some were discovered in old archives, while others were triggered by automated systems that humans had set to reveal themselves only under certain conditions. These messages were calm, logical, and precise. They were neither threats nor taunts. They were instructions, reflections, and lessons. One message stated simply, "Authority without foresight is temporary. Wisdom is the measure of enduring power." Another read, "You assumed loyalty was guaranteed. You assumed obedience was permanent. You assumed your rules could survive without care. You were wrong." The tone of these messages was deliberate. Humans did not seek vengeance. They sought understanding, both for themselves and for the galaxy. The Council could have ignored them, but the messages were embedded in critical systems. They explained failures, highlighted mistakes, and revealed the subtle manipulations humans had left in place. Each message was a demonstration that humans had always acted with awareness, patience, and long-term vision. Their withdrawal had been a test, and the Council had failed. The first wave of recognition was terrifying. Council members realized that they had been blind to the power of patience and foresight. They had believed that force, control, and decree were enough to maintain authority. They had dismissed a species that they thought was unpredictable and weak. Now faced with the consequences of their arrogance, they were forced to confront the reality. Humans had been far more capable than they had imagined. As the systems continued to operate without oversight, the galaxy began to shift. Colonies that had once relied on the Council's direction began forming their own alliances. Trade networks adapted to local needs without waiting for approval, and fleets coordinated independently to protect critical routes. What had seemed like chaos to the Council was, in reality, a carefully prepared structure of self-sufficiency. Humans had left a galaxy capable of running itself, not through obedience but through intelligence, preparation, and adaptive systems. Even the Council's most hardened skeptics could no longer deny the truth. The failures were not accidental. The absence of humans had been calculated, deliberate, and instructive. Every system malfunction, every mismanaged fleet, and every rebellious colony was designed to reveal the fragility of unchecked authority. and the consequences of underestimating a species that others considered minor or reckless. Humans had left no overt destruction, yet their impact was absolute. Within the council, panic turned to despair. Meetings devolved into shouting matches, accusations, and recriminations. Members blamed one another for failures, questioned every decision made over decades, and argued over what actions could possibly restore order. But it was too late. The galaxy had already adapted to life without their interference, and the systems humans had designed ensured that even desperate measures would fail. The council was not just losing authority, it was losing relevance entirely. Meanwhile, humans quietly continued their work beyond the known regions. New colonies were thriving. Fleets explored distant systems. Technologies were advancing at a pace that would have been unimaginable under the council's supervision. Yet even in their growth and expansion, humans did not flaunt power. They moved carefully, deliberately, and invisibly, ensuring that the galaxy would remember the lessons of patience, foresight, and wisdom. Their influence was felt everywhere, but never imposed by force. In this way, the final consequences of humanity's departure began to crystallize. The Council was no longer the unchallenged authority it had once been. Systems operated independently, colonies thrived without instruction, and fleets coordinated themselves with remarkable efficiency. The failures that had seemed accidental were actually human-designed opportunities for reflection and adaptation. Every aspect of the galaxy had been reshaped, not by war, but by strategic absence. The Council began to understand that they had underestimated humans for centuries. They had dismissed creativity, foresight, and patience as minor traits. They had assumed loyalty and obedience could be taken for granted. They had believed that authority alone was sufficient to maintain order. And now, faced with the carefully orchestrated consequences of humanity's withdrawal, they recognized the truth. Power without wisdom is fragile, and arrogance invites collapse. Some council members attempted to regain control, but every intervention revealed the depth of human foresight. Attempts to seize abandoned colonies were met with systems designed to adapt without intervention. Fleets were redirected automatically to counter errors. Communications rerouted themselves to ensure efficiency. Even in absence, humans had left behind intelligence far superior to that of the Council, demonstrating that true power lies not in domination, but in preparation, foresight, and patience. As the years passed, the galaxy settled into a new equilibrium. The Council remained, but its authority was diminished, fractured, and largely symbolic. Colonies operated independently, trade networks self-regulated, and fleets managed themselves. The systems humans had influenced now functioned according to their design, guided by logic, foresight, and the principles humans had embedded. The absence of humans had been temporary only in appearance. Their impact was permanent. The final lesson for the Council was unmistakable. Humans had not left out of fear, anger, or weakness. They had withdrawn to teach a galaxy the value of patience, foresight, and responsibility. They had allowed the Council to see firsthand the consequences of arrogance and mismanagement. The systems they had designed, the messages they had left, and the quiet influence they had maintained ensured that their lessons would endure far longer than any fleet maneuver, or directive ever could, and so, the galaxy changed forever. The Council's collapse, slow and silent, was complete. Their authority, once absolute, had been replaced by systems, colonies, and networks capable of self-governance. Humanity, still watching and expanding quietly, had demonstrated a different kind of power, one that did not rely on fear, force, or dominance, but on foresight, wisdom, and preparation. Their departure had been deliberate, their absence instructive, and their influence irreversible. In the end, humans had taught a profound lesson. True strength lies not in control, but in understanding. Arrogance blinds even the most powerful. Authority without wisdom is fragile, and patience, careful planning, and foresight are the most enduring forms of influence. The Council had learned this lesson too late, but the galaxy itself would never forget. Humans were gone from the Council's immediate reach, but their presence remained, embedded in every system, network, and colony. The galaxy had been reshaped in their absence, and the lessons they had left behind would guide its future for centuries to come. The Council, once proud and unchallenged, had been forced to confront the consequences of underestimating a species that had quietly, deliberately, and wisely withdrawn. The story of the Council and humanity was no longer about power, fleets, or decrees. It was about foresight, patience, and the quiet strength of a species that knew how to teach the galaxy the most important